Good morning. This is not going to be a tutorial. It's going to be kind of a breakdown of how I got from what looks like pus breaking to flowers coming out of the field, introducing some more life to those flowers, and then trying to bring some more creatures and other plants into it. The creatures ended up being way more complicated than I was expecting them to be, but they are super satisfying once they finally started working and didn't just spin on the spot or try to eat each other. So I'll be taking you through pretty much the whole process of how I got from A to B. This is not a tutorial, I'm not going to be going through step by step on anything, but it might be of interest to those of you that are interested in the creative process behind something like this. So yeah, this is how the first node tree came out, which is fairly simple, very easy to follow, but was complete chaos and didn't really work very well. The next node tree you're about to see is quite a lot more in depth, and there's bits of it which I think I got lost along the way. There's probably redundant areas in here as well, because actually I lost track of what was doing what at some points. But the end result is quite beautiful still, so I'm okay with this. So, going back to this first node tree, I'm going to just talk through this one because this just lays out the basis for everything else going on. So first of all, you have a point going into the system. That point just gets a little bit of random velocity, and so long as it hasn't hit the ground, you then add some gravity to it. Next, you obviously need to know whether it's hit the ground or not, so there's just a very basic setup down below for detecting if something has or has not hit the floor. And then you also have to register that point as hitting the ground. If it has hit the ground, we want to duplicate those points, so each point will create 2 more points, and each of those points will have a random velocity applied to it. Now, an important note here is that you also have to put a blocker on the original point that hit the floor, because otherwise it will spawn a point every single frame, and that just causes so much chaos so quickly. We've joined now all that into the rest of the tree, and then we add a bit of an age parameter. So basically, once it's hit the ground, we start having an age, so you can control the scale of that object once it's hit the ground. And just want a very simple, just curve down. So once it's been once it's reached an age of 20, it will just disappear. Add a basic ball material, and that is about it. Fairly simple. This very quickly turns into just complete chaos, because as you can see here, as every single point hits, it's instantly creating 2 more points, which after a while it starts to look a little bit like white noise, but this is definitely not the effect I was initially looking for. So in the next phase I changed it up so they have to have a certain age before it would produce the other duplicates. I also introduced a little bit of randomness into how many points each ball would produce, just to add a bit more life to it. I also changed the way the ball would grow and shrink over its lifespan, just to make it seem less like it's popping in and out of existence. Unfortunately, this also has the effect, as you can see on the right, of kind of looking like it's pus spoils just breaking over and over again. Not a very appealing look, is it? Oh well, we'll fix that. First of all though, I wanted to fix up the terrain, because the old terrain was just very flat, very boring, and I wanted to get something a bit more dynamic going. So I put this together with a little bit of camera culling. This just really helps to keep your render times from going completely nuts. This is the node tree I used for the terrain, if it helps. This just meant that whenever I altered the terrain, it would automatically set the materials to match what I wanted it to do. This obviously also meant some changes to the node tree for the blobs as they currently were. This meant 2 things. It meant detecting impacts of water, and it meant detecting impacts with any steep grounds. I didn't want anything growing on the cliff faces as such. So, as you can see at the top, I've just got a very simple, if it raycasts down to water, it's an impact. And then you can see down below, I used the hit normal from the ground impact, and then if that was of an angle steeper than a certain amount, then that would also count as a bad impact. Those points would then be deleted. While I was in the process of this though, I also used the hit normal from where they hit the ground to affect the velocity of the new points. So when it would hit the ground, it would go out in a direction away from the ground it just hit, rather than just going up in the air. That's still just basically blobs in a field though, right? We can do better. Blobs and rocks in a field, much better. This obviously adds a few complications in, so let's stick with, if it hits the water, we're just deleting it. Easy. But if it impacts with a rock, or impacts with steep ground, we're actually going to store that information, because I'm going to have those points explode outwards, like it's ricocheted off a wall. So we need to know if it's impacted with a rock. We need to also know if it's impacted with steep ground. And if it's happened, either of those two things have happened, we're going to store the normal of the impact, and we're going to label that point as having a bad impact. And we're going to set the velocity of that to 0. So it hits the wall, it stays there, and it's labelled as being not good. These points all get separated off, so only points with not bad impacts will go and duplicate. But then you've got the age of the impact, which is important for later on because it runs up to a maximum amount of time. And we go through into our second simulation. So what the simulation is doing is it's separating off any points that had bad impact, and then if the age of that point is greater than 10, it will delete it. If it's not greater than 10, we're going to give it some random velocity based on the impact normal, and then we're going to add a little bit of gravity to it, not a lot, just a smidge, and then that is pretty much it. And you just add a material and a sort of size from there. You don't need to do any duplicating of points on this one, because for every single frame where the age is less than 10, it'll be adding a fresh point in. So it's effectively 10 points that come into the simulation and then get deleted. The end result of this is, as you can sort of see on your right here, is that you can actually get those little sparks of impact where they hit the rock. So at this point we've definitely had enough of blobs. Let's switch over to flowers. So first off, I'm going to separate out all the points that have hit the ground, so we only want points that have hit the ground to become flowers. The other points are points that are in the air still, so they're kind of the seeds, so we're going to leave those as just balls, make it simple. Then we're going to use the age function still to feed into the growth control of the flowers, and this is where I've got a little bit interesting. So I designed a very basic flower, and I do mean basic, like you're going to be creating a lot of these points, you don't want it to be too intense on your computer. And this was one of my first attempt at this, and to be honest, I'd ignore most of this because I do actually switch to a curve-based system later on, but the essence still stays the same in terms of I'm trying to use the age to control the various scales of objects, whether it's the petal, the top of the plant, the leaves at the bottom, the stem, and then that all feeds into everything. And I still use more or less that kind of system, but I just, at the moment, it's relying on the idea of flowers being a certain height and those parts being a certain height, so it puts the next point on top of that height, and it didn't work in the end. Now, one bit I did keep a little bit more of was the animation side of things. So basically I wanted the petals to spin and flick when they put out a seed, so you've got a visual cue as to what's going on, and that I do kind of use here, so you can kind of see that they got a system where something will move and then go back to its original position. That kind of works, so as you can kind of see on to the side here in a moment, it was effective. I was quite happy with that, and I think I did tweak it and refine it later on, but it was better. I ended up introducing a couple of extra parameters into the delete function because I noticed there were some issues where seeds were landing too close to other plants and you'd get plants intersecting. So that this first box you can see down the bottom is just aimed at if a seed lands within X distance of an established plant, it gets deleted. Similarly, if the next box up is looking at if it starts too close to a rock, it gets deleted. This is just because we want to avoid them actually intersecting with each other. And the final point is just if it has fallen off the edge of the map, it should be deleted. Simple. So around this time I also stopped deleting points when they reached a certain age. This is just, I also wanted to see how far the flowers would spread without it. But this did mean that I wanted to introduce some extra restrictions on how many you can see on camera, so I put in the camera culling function for both the seeds going out and the flowers, just because there's no point rendering them if you can't see them. Though you do have to make sure you tweak the size of the camera culling, because if you've got a camera close to the floor, you might accidentally cut a flower off while you're approaching it. But at the same time, I also finally adjusted the points to flowers node, so it was a little neater. I do mean a little neater, but using the curves instead is a lot better for something like this, because then you can place something at the end of the curve, so regardless of what point the curve growth was at, the flower top would be at the top of the curve, which is a lot easier to manage than managing instance heights rather. This then all feeds down to the bottom, and as you can see, there's been some adjustments made to the animation parameters, but those are constantly adjusted over the course of this. They're a little bit better now, but that is as it is. The other thing that I added at this stage was trees. So the trees function, very, very similar to the flowers function, really, because in essence it's still a plant. It throws out seeds, the seeds propagate, etc. But for trees, they take longer over it, but they can send out more seeds. I'm not going to actually even show you what's behind the door on the points to trees thing, because it came out very ugly, as you'll see on the screen at the moment. And frankly, no, there's definitely better ways to do it, and you can kind of see how it came out. I was never really happy with how the trees looked, even in the final version. But I think I just simply didn't put enough time into those. With that being said, here you can see the final node tree I used for the trees, and the result of that on the right hand side. They are not the best, but they do function. I ended up keeping them as more of a background thing in the final shot. Also, while I'm looking at it, we also had to add this in for the flowers, because while the tree doesn't care whether a flower is there or not, a flower should care if the tree is there. So essentially the seed pods would ricochet off the tree trunk. So, who would have thought it, but making a series of little creatures that are going to go and eat all the plants, now they're not just despawning by themselves, actually very complicated. But here is how it kind of all started. So, obviously you initialize, you want your points to be eaten, and you want your creature. And you need to set them up as such. You've got the register where the plant position is, you need to register these points as being plants. You've got the creature position, and register them as creature. This little setup here is invaluable. You have to find the nearest point, tell it that you want it to go towards that point, and set the velocity as such. The only thing I did do is, as it gets closer to a point, the velocity slows down. This is the idea of just preventing it from speeding past that point or just zooming towards every single point. Otherwise it's a little too quick. And then obviously, if the plant is within X amount of the nearest point, it gets deleted. Now unfortunately this also means if it spawns within its, like if two plants spawned within a certain distance from each other, they would have been deleted as well. So while 100 points were initialized, you won't necessarily get 100 points out at the other end. And then that's actually it on this first node setup for creatures. Very simple, but it's kind of satisfying to watch that little point just go around chasing other points. I then changed this so the points weren't instantly deleted, but they just registered as being in contact with when a creature came around to them, which then would be registered as if the plant has not been in contact with, their age is going up. If the plant has got contact with them, their age goes down. And when a plant's age goes back to 0, it gets deleted. The obvious flaw in this plan, however, is that as time goes on, the plant's age gets so large that it takes forever for the creature to eat a plant. Here's the issue that gave me the single biggest headache out of everything with this node tree. And that is, a creature does not know if another object is a creature or a plant. It just goes to the point and it eats the point. So when you have more than one creature, they get stuck on each other, eventually, inevitably stuck. And once they are stuck, they will not move, because as far as they're concerned, they are nearest to the closest point. So why would they move? Why would they change? This is an issue so frustrating to the point that I actually avoided it for a while and just had one creature for many iterations of this formula, until I eventually worked out a couple of ways that would indicate to the creature that they are stuck. Before I got to that point, however, there were a couple of other issues I wanted to fix, because it became obvious after I added an actual object as the creature in that it would just snap to a direction rather than trending towards it, which I wasn't happy with. So essentially, to make this work, I needed to know the current target versus the old target, because I couldn't just work on whatever the nearest point was, because that's what's causing the snapping initially. I needed to be able to transition between one to the other. So, this is all a little bit backwards, because we actually come through here first. We need to have a target set, we need to know what that vector is, and then once the creature has reached that, i.e. there is a contact point, it is going to start counting how long it's been in contact for, and at the point of contact it's going to store that initial vector now as the old target. With that in mind, it can use that counter to mix between current target versus the old target. And then when it's turning around, it will turn appropriately to match that. As you can kind of see on the screen, it's overdoing it, it's overshooting, but the concept is there, which is what I'm really looking for at this point. And then I can kind of, once you've got something like that working, you can fine tune it into place. As a last ditch effort to avoid the conundrum of adding more creatures in, I switched out the points for the flowers that I had in the previous sim. It does look a little bit more pretty, although there was an odd thing of the flowers lifting off the floor as they got eaten, which wasn't intentional. Okay, fine, I did eventually work out how to get the creatures to not get stuck on one another, but I warn you now, it's not pretty, and I'm not happy with this. I also did change quite a lot about this as time goes on, so we will revisit this one as well. Okay, this is going to get confusing, so just stick with me here and we'll fuddle through this together. So there's a lot of Boolean math going on. Let's go with this one up here first. Let's say creature's not in contact, but their velocity is reduced down to very little, i.e. they are going very slowly somewhere. In this situation, we can ignore the ors for now, and they are definitely a creature, because it's not a plant for whatever reason. Make sure contact is set to 0, target set is set to 0. What this will mean is that they will potentially get a new target aligned to them when they next come around here, which can then reset them into going into motion again. Just gonna get rid of that now. Okay. Next one here. Sample the index of nearest, sample the index of the nearest and see if they have the attribute creature. If they do, and you are yourself a creature, then also reset target and contact for the same reason. So unset your target and hope you might kiss a plant nearby instead. However, at the same time as that, if the target is already not set, then follow that through. Then you are going to switch your current vector to a vector that is the opposite direction to the creature that you're nearest to. A note to make on here as well, that also goes to around here, where it will set creature interact as true. Actually, you'll set keep creature interact to whatever this is. And last but not least, if that is all true, then it's also going to try and shift your sample index. So let's say index of nearest is a creature. What if index of nearest +2 is actually more than likely going to be a plant instead? Therefore, that is okay, and we'll move towards that. There you go, wasn't so bad. It took a while to come up with all of those, because frequently I think I came up with this bit first, and then found that it wouldn't work without that, then it wouldn't work without this, then it wouldn't work without that, and it basically grew into what looks here like an absolute mess of math. While we're looking at a mess of math though, you'll notice on the previous clip that there's some born creatures coming in, and essentially once the creature has consumed a certain amount of plant, they will duplicate. And this is only really possible now that they don't collide with each other whenever they have consumed X amount of plant. Problem is though, is that even with all of this in, it was still only really looking at a creature on a flat plane with no objects to interact with. So what about if it's a more varied terrain, or if it's got rocks on it, like our intended terrain does have? Yeah, well that's another set of problems. And while I did partially resolve these before combining everything together, the actual best solution was found after I put everything together. So I'm going to show you those solutions, and then I'll show you how I put everything into one. So it turned out that the avoiding rocks was actually very simple, in terms of you just needed to get all your rocks into a collection, realise them in instances, find the nearest surface, and based off that just reflect around it. And you just mix that in to your normal velocity, so it's interacting a bit with both. You kind of see, like, based on the distance away from the face, so change how much you are reflecting off that. So that was very, very simple, and in fact both things were very simple in the end. But this is what I ended up with in terms of keeping people to the ground planes. Now, this was initially just this area here minus this one and this one. But what I realised over time was that the ray direction was bringing the creature up to the terrain if it had got it down below. But let's say the creature then was hovering above the terrain, it wasn't pulling it down because the ray direction was only going in one direction. So I needed to have the inverse going on, so I've got the position, the position minus the ground versus the ground minus the position. So I've got the ray direction going in two different directions, so it's either pulling it up to the ground plane or putting it down to the ground plane, and in the process of that I'm also getting the hit normal, so that the creature will be rotated to match that normal. This way they stick to the ground the entire time without any issue. And this needs to go into a set position, and it only does this when it has a hit, which it should do almost every frame because it's moving around, but because sometimes the plant it's going to is on the same normal as the direction it's already going in, it'll actually already be sticking to the ground plane without needing to be altered. Keeps it fairly simple at that stage. This was my first attempt at connecting the plant part of the operation to the creature side of the operation. Needless to say, as you can probably see from the mess of nodes going on here, it didn't work. Because my intention had always been that the creatures would be a simulation that joins on after the plants. It didn't work out because, well, I'm not entirely sure why it didn't work out in the end. But I tried a number of different ways of connecting it and different parameters that told it as to what was going on, but it was having none of it, so inevitably I ended up having to connect both of these networks to each other, which presented a whole new list of issues, but did eventually work. So let's move on to the next version of that. So in fact, the next few versions didn't vary all that much. There were some tweaks taken out, there were some adjustments made, but the actual final node tree compared to what the node tree looked like for these is not all that different. However, there were one or two issues that I did want to get fixed up before pushing out as close to a final product as I think I'm ever going to get. These issues, you may have noticed them a couple of times with the creatures as they were going around, but essentially when they interact with each other, you get that quick snap. One for the creature snapping to go away from each other, and another one when it snaps to go towards the next plant. And the other thing you'll have seen is when they get stuck between two other creatures, they start gesturing back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and it's just very unappealing. The solution to this was twofold. One, I needed to stop the rotation happening when a creature was interacting with another creature, so it would stick with its old trajectory rather than trying to snap to a new trajectory every frame. And the other part of it was that I needed to, much like I've mixed the velocities in the past with changing from one plant to the other, I needed to also have that happen as it came into or out of an interaction with another creature, so it would turn towards the plant rather than snap to a plant, and it would turn away from each other rather than snapping away from each other. This just essentially required two more counters, one that started when they started interacting with each other, and one that started when they stopped. And then those you're using to mix nodes to mix between the two. Fairly simple in the end, but it had been a long time since I'd actually thought of anything like that. As you can see, this results in a much smoother transition when they've interacted with one another, which overall in the final video, when you get a lot of the creatures next to each other, it really does make a difference. You still see a little bit of snapping with one or two of them, but it is significantly better than it was. Okay, so what you've got here is you've got the final node tree. So this is the whole thing, going from making the plants grow, adding on the creatures, giving the creatures some control, showing where to go, and controlling the whole life cycle that goes with that. And at the very end, just give them all materials and scaling them accordingly. I'm not gonna go into full depth on this because I'm sure you guys have already had enough of nodes for today, but let's have a quick run through the only bits that I didn't actually cover initially. So, what you've got is, right at the start, just initializing a load of points, and just, that's what I'm here because I didn't explain this before, I've just initialized a bunch of points and brought them up to the surface. This is just so I've got more than one starting point, just to help get things going initially. Then a lot of this is as it was before. There's a few additional nodes from in here, just basically saying make sure it's not a creature. So it's not pinning creatures to the ground, it's not deleting them, it's not saying if a creature walks into a rock it's going to explode. All those kind of things, which maybe I'll include in a future one. I do want to play around more with the creatures in future. I think they're definitely the most interesting part of this whole thing for me. But yeah, that's it. The entire green box here, that's basically controlling everything about the plants. Actually relatively small and contained compared to what goes on next. After that point, we separate out, well, delete any points from the bad impact that have aged past a certain stage. Separate out the geometry and we go to, right, if you are a creature, this is what you're going to do. Similarly to the plants, I added the creatures in right at the start, so the startup creatures kind of initialized, not right at the start, because I found that the plants needed to be alive for a certain period of time before the creatures were introduced to the world. But that's it, there's only about 100 frames or so, which in the grand scheme of things isn't much at all. We then go into controlling the creature's velocity. Like I said, I've gone through this a couple of times now back and forth, but there's an awful lot of attributes that end up being used there. There are almost certainly neater and more concise ways of doing this. I couldn't find them, but I'm sure they're there, and I'm sure that I just missed them in the process. Let's go on down to here. Got finding out what point there was in contact. Controlling the plant age, though, there was This is the only bit of the plants that is controlled inside of the creature outlet rather than the plant outlet. That's only because this particular set of attributes also helps control the creature's age and how many points they've consumed, so it's necessary to keep that as the initial one. Moving on from there, you've got deleting all the points with 0, you've got duplicating the creatures, make sure the creatures are reset on certain attributes so you don't end up carrying over like their age or whether they're an adult or anything like that. And yeah, like I say, got the final bits here, and that is it. That's the whole thing. Looking at it now, I feel like it should take me much less time to get to this stage than it did. On the other hand, there was an awful lot of points where I didn't know what I was doing. There's been quite a steep learning curve, but it's been fun, and I would definitely recommend going into something like this. I think the important points for me were going in with a clear idea of what it was I wanted to do from the outlet. So I knew I wanted to have plants, I knew I wanted the plants to spread, and I knew I wanted to have little creatures that were going to go around and eat those plants. And yeah, and then sort of throwing it in mind as to, well, how do they eat the plants? What happens when they do eat the plants? What happens at that stage? Yeah, I hope you've all enjoyed this. It's taken years of my life, but thank you for listening.